Hi, my name is Chrissy McKelvey, and I am doing a final presentation for Introduction to Sociology 101. I decided to go ahead and do it on conflict theory, sociological perspective, and our criminal justice system. So, conflict theory was first developed by Karl Marx. It is a theory that society is in a state of perpetual conflict because of competition for limited resources. Um, so, I have a picture of Karl Marx here. Brutality is typical for laws dictated by cowardice. For cowardice can be energetic only by being cruel. Conflict theory equals mandatory minimums and prosecutor coercion. And this is how I'm tying in criminal justice system with conflict theory. Because there's also with conflict theory is a struggle for power. And of course, the prosecutors, they have that right of discretion that they had transferred to them from the judges in 1984 because there was too much bias and discrimination and disparity in sentencing. So the Congress decided to go ahead and write up the sentencing guidelines for the federal aspect of the judicial system. And so when they did write up the guidelines, they also came up with mandatory minimum sentences, which is a minimum amount of time you're going to serve in prison to pay your debt to society. Um, Here's some other key aspects of the conflict theory. It kind of doesn't have a whole lot to do with the criminal justice system aspect as I'm presenting right now, but these are just so you get a better idea of what conflict theory is. Uh, so what it's saying is the majority of the population, which is the working class, which I'm part of, will work for the wealthy and the elite, per se. So we work for them, we sell them our labor, and they are the only ones who have access to the means of production through when industrialization was going on. It had meant that the elite were the only ones who had access to the means of production. Sorry. Without the ability to produce for themselves, the mass were dependent on the elite for survival. So we sell them our labor in order to make our ends meet. Um, so now I'm going to move on to the prosecutor's coercive tactics equals power struggle, which is also a part of conflict theory. Prosecutors hold all the power. Prosecutorial coercion, which is mandatory minimum sentences being used as a threat. Take plea deal or get harsh mandatory minimum sentence penalties. So what they'll do is they will have charges filed against you, and as the plea deal, they will drop some of those charges, and most likely they're going to be the ones that carry the mandatory minimum sentence, and they will offer you this plea deal that sounds actually better because the time in prison is cut by quite a bit. Now, if you do not take that plea deal and you exercise your right to a fair trial and you get found guilty, that's when they implement trial penalty, which I am going to be explaining here in just a minute. Also, discrimination. It was supposed to end when the discretion was passed over to prosecutors, and it has not. It has been proven that an African American or Hispanic male are going to get longer sentences than a white male. And the disparity, this ties into discrimination. Prosecutors use their discretion when it comes to filing charges. Research has proven that African Americans perceive the most discriminatory sentences. And then I also have another picture here of Karl Marx. The moral power cannot be created by the paragraphs of law. And I think what he means by that is moral power. Uh, yeah, the prosecutor's ethics and the way they do things in the courtroom is not ethical or moral in any way. So we're going to move on to trial penalty, which is what I was talking about earlier. And I think this ties into conflict theory because it has everything to do with power and the power and the struggle for it. Uh, so the trial penalty refers to the substantial difference between the sentence offered in a plea offer prior to trial versus the sentence a defendant receives after trial. This penalty is now so severe and pervasive that it has virtually eliminated the constitutional right to a trial. To avoid the penalty, accused persons must surrender many other fundamental rights which are essential to a fair justice system. Um, so when they are do the trial penalty, I have an example here I will show you. And it definitely ties into conflict theory because Marx does not give a clear definition of power for him. Power means coercion. Marx views power to be held by a particular group in society at the expense of the rest. So Rogel Aguilera Medeiros rejected a plea deal, so he got 110 years in prison. And this is the man who was driving the semi-truck in 2019, whose brakes failed him, and he ended up crashing into three other semis and 12 cars. He actually killed 4 people. I know that that's right, because when he was in court, he was crying. And it was not crying because he wanted to get out of trouble. It was crying because he truly felt sorry that he had taken those 4 lives when his brakes malfunctioned and failed him. Uh, so the prosecutor, or the district attorney, King, said she pursued the punishment after Aguilera Medeiros insisted on his right to trial. My administration contemplated a significantly different outcome in this case and initiated plea negotiations, but Mr. Aguilera Medeiros declined to consider anything other than a traffic ticket. King's statement may not shock the conscience at first glance. Plea deals are a fixture of the U.S. criminal legal system, but her remarks hit at something deeper. By her own admission, Aguilera Medeiros was sentenced to die in prison, not because the state felt that that was the fair and just punishment, but because he insisted on exercising his constitutional right to trial. Your right to a fair trial is your Sixth Amendment, if anybody doesn't know that. Called the trial penalty, prosecutors are known to pile on superfluous charges and threaten astronomical prison time unless the defendant agrees to plead guilty and save them the trouble of a trial. Should the defendant insist on his innocence and should a jury disagree, he will likely receive a much more severe sentence for the same actions. The only difference is that he invoked his Sixth Amendment right. So Governor Jared Polis heard the outcries of the organizations that are in defense for offenders like Rogel Aguilera Medeiros, who did not hurt anybody on purpose. He was actually charged with first-degree assault, attempted first-degree assault, and both those charges right there carry mandatory minimum sentences. So when he was found guilty, he was charged with those, and those mandatory minimum sentences are part of that 110 years that he got. Anyway, Governor Jared Polis, he signed to where Rogel only got 10 years, which I think is still a little ridiculous. But, it's better than 110 years and him spending the rest of his life in prison for a mere accident and because he didn't take a plea deal that the district attorney was offering him. And that ties into conflict theory because that's a power struggle. I mean, you don't accept their plea deal, they get mad. And so they send you to prison for the rest of your life. That's just them exercising their power, and not in a good way at all. Prosecutors are the part of our society that is considered as elite. They hold the power over offenders, the police, judges, defense attorneys, and the whole judicial system. It is the prosecutor's discretion, which I have mentioned, that decides every offender's fate. If you are African American, your chances of getting a fair deal is a quarter of what a white person's is. All the research and studies have proven this. There is the gradient thesis, which predicts that African Americans receive the most injustice, followed by Hispanics and whites, respectively. The statistics here is the racial threat hypothesis is rarely able to be tested directly. In general, researchers look at the way racial threat is impacted by its structural roots, that is, the relative size of minorities in the population, on the size and behavior of crime control systems, just such as prisons and jails. So what they do is they look at the total number, let's say, of the total percentage of African Americans throughout the whole United States population, which is usually about 24.7% of the U.S. population are African Americans. And then they will go to the prison systems or jail systems, and they'll look at the percentage there. And usually it hits around 77% of the population is African Americans. So that's quite the huge difference there. And here's another table. It shows in yellow the white men in prison, and in orange black men in prison. It goes through age groups 18 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, and so on and so forth. You look at 35 to 39, you see there's 958 white men in prison, and this is per 100,000. And then per 100,000 of the African Americans, it's 4,832. So that right there just proves of the discrimination that goes on in our judicial system. And my conclusion is the conflict perspective views crime control as a way to promote social elites' particular interests, which I think that I have placed the prosecutors and district attorneys in the social elite. They are the oppressors and the offenders are the oppressed. But the concept is that this will change and therefore create the conflict in conflict theory. It is said that the social changes that happen in our society are what create conflict theory, and well, not create the conflict theory, but what conflict theory is about the struggle for power, and when it changes, the struggle that happens with that. And so, therefore, this creates the conflict and conflict theory. I have a picture here that says criminal justice system is controlled by a small group of people who have power, which is the prosecutors and the district attorney, because they are. I mean, the judges have a little bit of power, but not really. And it also sees the law as an instrument of oppression, which I agree with. And my references here, I use 3 of them. So I hope you enjoyed my recording, and I hope you learned something you didn't know before. Thank you.